And time now to take a look at the international papers, and to do that for us here in the studio is Belle Upton, and beginning in Egypt, Belle, where of course the country is reflecting on the 5 years since the revolution.
It is, and we start with an Egyptian paper. So 5 years on, one of the young organisers of the January 25th uprising that eventually toppled Hosni Mubarak talks to the press. The paper is called Al-Masri Al-Yaoum. It's an independent paper that says it's liberal leaning, and it's run by a businessman. The protester is Abdel Rahman Mansour, who was finishing his studies in 2011. He co-founded a Facebook page and a anti-torture campaign in honour of Khaled Said, who was an Alexandrian man who was killed at the hands of the police. Now, it was Mansour who set the date for the 25th of January for a peaceful protest. Now, little was he to know at the time that that would become the uprising and then a revolution. In the interview, Mansour expresses his disappointment at where Egypt is now. He says that Mubarak's police state is effectively back, but just with a new leader, i.e. Al-Sisi. He deplores Al-Sisi's choice to become increasingly militant, especially when it comes to cracking down on public spaces in Egypt. Freedom of expression, he says, has been muzzled, and he says that Sisi is at war with the January 25th protesters. He absolutely wants to silence them.
This is a very unusual sort of article to appear in the Egyptian press, isn't it, Belle? And I mean, given that the media is largely controlled by the military government, how has the rest of the media been telling the story?
Well, definitely in the way that you would assume, the way that you would expect. So we've got one paper to show you here. This is Ahram, which is essentially on its front page has a big picture of Sisi, quotes him verbatim during his speech to mark the 25th of January, where he says, Egypt has turned from a nation dedicated to one group of people to a nation dedicated to everybody.
Now, coming back to France, and there's much concern about the President's decision to extend the state of emergency, which is currently in place here in the nation. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, the front page of Libération says it pretty well. It has its headline, État d'urgence, égalité, fraternité. You can see it there. Now that, of course, is a play on the famous French motto, liberté, égalité, fraternité, which means freedom, equality, fraternity. The first word there, liberté, has been crossed out, and you've got state of emergency put there instead. Now that is because, according to Libération, the ongoing state of emergency in France is eroding French freedoms, which are highly prized. Now that state of emergency has been in place since the Paris attacks on the 13th of November. It was meant to expire tomorrow, but François Hollande has decided to extend it by another 3 months. Libération says the exception is becoming the rule. It also asks sarcastically, why stop at the end of May? We've got the Football European Championships coming up in June in France. Now, it'll be difficult for the government to explain a return to business as usual right before that security-fraught event. Now, the Libération goes on to say the decision is driven more by politics than it is by actual security issues. The Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, is quoted wondering, if an attack happened a fortnight after we lifted the state of emergency, can you imagine how much we would be blamed? The paper goes on to have an interview with an intelligence agent who says that actually these measures, this state of emergency, does very little to prevent another attack, in part because the Charlie Hebdo attack and the 13th of November attacks were organised outside of French jurisdiction in Belgium. So no amount of police raids can shut those people down.
Yes, it's certainly causing a lot of debate here in France. Now, security is also playing a very big part in the French papers today, not just European security, but in India, where, of course, French President François Hollande is currently on a visit.
Yeah, so while all these discussions are going on about French security, Hollande is in India, where security has been stepped up massively, as has the terrorist threat in that country. A few days ago, the French consulate in Bangalore in the south of India received death threats aimed at the president, at Hollande that is, and signed by Al-Qaeda. So in total, in response, 6,000 officers and 1,200 soldiers have been mobilised for the visit.
And finally, Storm Jonas struck the US East Coast over the weekend and gave many people a few snow days.
It did. You can imagine the pictures that are on most of the front pages in the US press. Here we've got a lovely one on the front of the International New York Times. The caption reads, "Walk on the white side."
Very nice.
It's nice, isn't it? A pun, of course, on the famous Lou Reed song. And we've got some other images that are walking on the wild side. So here you can see one in the Washington Post, a snowball fight, looking really fairly involved and dynamic there. There's also in the Washington Post a handy graphic explaining how big Snowzilla, as it was dubbed, might have been. Now, they take here the square metres of the snowfall over the capital, and they work out that it amounts to a whopping 1 billion cubic metres of snow, which they've put in a nice little snowman shape so that you could see how big that would be if it was all compacted up together. Now, many of the flights were grounded over the weekend, and here in this image you can see why. That's Dulles International Airport with the snow removers coming on and trying to get rid of what they can. And one thing that's quite interesting is in DC, fines will still be applied to cars that are found on the road where they shouldn't be. So to those people who try to take out their car in the snow and fail, you will still get fined, so just don't risk it.
Yeah, you've got to have to move very quickly indeed. Belle Upton there with the press review.